I was actually researching a lot about you for the past couple of days and trying to find out more information about what your focus is. And something I was mentioning to Tracy was meditation, shamanism, Eastern traditions. It seems to kind of flow around almost everything that maybe a spiritual consumer would want to kind of get a hold of. And I don't know if you have a focus that you're working on right now, or if there's anything that's particularly relevant to your work today that you just kind of wanted to expand on a little bit.
Okay, well, one of the delights of this field is that there are so many topics of interest, and one of the privileges of having tenure in a university is that you can indulge those interests, and so I've been very fortunate in being able to explore a variety of topics in transpersonal psychology, and it's such a wonderfully large umbrella that almost any spiritual interest can fit into it. So I've happily meandered through a variety of topics, as you mentioned, from shamanism to meditation to spiritual experiences to spiritual traps to meditation's been a major theme. And I've particularly enjoyed looking at the great spiritual traditions and contemplative traditions. I've been particularly interested in looking at the common themes. One of the questions which really strikes me as perhaps one of the most important we can ask, and for the first time in history one we can possibly answer, is what do the great religious and spiritual traditions say are the most important qualities for us to develop as human beings, and what do they say about how we can develop them? So that's been a major interest, and that was a focus for a number of years, and that culminated in the book Essential Spirituality. So that general process or goal of looking for common themes, looking what the wise people across centuries have agreed on, and what's most important for living a full, let alone an enlightened life, has been a central theme. And then, of course, the spiritual practices themselves. I've been intrigued by those. I've loved exploring them myself. My wife, Frances, calls me spiritually promiscuous, but that's a promiscuity she can handle. So, and again, it's a new gift in human history. There really hasn't been a time prior to this where one could explore multiple spiritual traditions and not end up at risk of ending up on a funeral pyre or a crucifix. So we tend to forget how rare and privileged we are in human history to first have access to all these traditions. I had a conversation with Ken Wilber a couple of years ago in which we were talking about how extraordinary it was to have access to all these traditions, and talking about being in the San Francisco Bay Area where the conference is going to be. And we were trying to think when the last time there was a place like San Francisco where all the world's major cultures, spiritual traditions and practices had come together. And the best we could come up with was Alexandria 2,000 years ago. So it's really pretty amazing, this opportunity we have and the privilege we have and the gift that the transpersonal field offers us by bringing together all these different traditions and allowing us for the first time to compare, to contrast, and to look at the common factors and universal principles and common truths. So those have been some interests. You asked what were current interests. Meditation continues to be an ongoing one. The topic which is pulling me most strongly at the moment is the topic of wisdom, which, as Frances pointed out, well, you're in an age where you're entitled to talk about it. If you don't start soon, you may not have a chance. So that topic has been pulling me, and it's obviously one which we tragically need, and yet amazingly has been almost completely neglected. When I first got interested in the topic, I went to the chairman of philosophy at University of California at Irvine and asked him what I should read, and he said, well, we made a great start 2,500 years ago, but things have been pretty dead for the last 2,000, which is not the kind of answer you want to hear, given that if there's anything the world needs at the present time, it's wisdom. And it's hard to think of a major social or global problem we're facing which doesn't in some way reflect a lack of wisdom. And, to my mind, humankind is in a race between sagacity and catastrophe, and it's not clear what way it's going, but there doesn't seem to be anything worth doing except working as hard as we all can in our own individual ways to try and make some contribution to our understanding of the issues we're looking at, and particularly to an understanding of their psychological and spiritual roots.
I want to talk about that because that was something that came to my mind in reading about a focus that you may have on the global crises and maybe the spiritual crises that we're facing the world today with the Occupy movement, which has been happening for the past couple of months. In your point of view, what does that represent, whether it's spiritually, whether it's on a global front, whether it's on a personal, psychological front? Do you have a response to that as far as being a professional in this field, and what do you have to say about things that are happening?
Well, as I look at the Occupy Wall Street movement, it seems an obviously timely response to what has been a growing inequality in our culture, our country, and a significant part of the Western world. And of course, that in turn is a reflection of a more pervasive and enduring inequality across the world. And anyone with any sensitivity has to be deeply concerned about the extent of inequality, and particularly the fact that it's growing. So in that way, I think all of us who have any social conscience will applaud a social response which aims to draw attention to and ameliorate social inequality. If we look at it from a psychological and spiritual perspective, then probably the movement reflects a lot of different motives and a lot of different levels of psychological maturity and spiritual maturity too, all the way from people who are just deeply aggrieved and angry and upset at a very basic survival level about what's being done to them and so many people, all the way through, for example, to people who look at it from a sense of social justice and distressed by what they see, through to people who have some spiritual concerns and out of care and compassion and a sense of justice want to respond in some way, all the way up to people who are looking at it from some deep spiritual perspective and recognizing that suffering requires an ethical response and an appropriate social response. So I guess I see it as reflecting many different aspects of our psyche and spirit.
Going back to what you were talking about before, dealing with the richness of the San Francisco Bay Area and the sheer amount of information that we have of being able to be spiritually promiscuous, as you put it. I've never heard it that way, and I appreciate that. Some would say that the shadow side of that, if I could use that term, would be, going back to that original question that I asked you, how do I know it's real when I'm dealing with all this information and all these traditions and so many different ways to, quote, be spiritual? How do I know whether or not I'm being duped or whether it's the real thing?
Yeah, it's a great question. It would be, well, I guess it's going to be a theme of the conference in one way. So hopefully we'll all get to explore this a little more deeply at the conference itself. And I think this is it's actually a wisdom question, and I think it's important to differentiate two kinds of questions. There are knowledge questions: is it raining outside? Take a look. No, end of question. And there are wisdom questions, which are more like koans. Every time you ask them, they take you deeper into yourself and deeper into reality. And the question, how do I use discernment, psychological discernment and spiritual discernment, and how do I cultivate that quality and capacity in myself, is really a wisdom question. So it's not something we have a one-time answer to. It's something that we need to keep asking. And it's not only how do we avoid getting duped by outside spiritual movements and forces and teachers, it's how do we avoid duping ourselves, which is even more tricky. So this is definitely a wisdom question, and one which will probably be with us for the rest of our lives. But I think there are some general principles. One is, the Buddha was asked, how do you assess a person's spiritual maturity? And said two things. One, it takes time. You have to spend time with them. And second, it's good to see the people under duress, under stress. Because most of us can look pretty good when things are going well. But when things get tough, I know for myself, my cracks show. And so that can also be true with teachers. We need to take time. The Dalai Lama says it's absolutely appropriate to spend several years assessing a spiritual teacher before committing yourself deeply to them. So it takes time. I think it's really important to ask around, ask our friends, ask people we trust. Who are the wise people we know, and what do they say? What's their assessment? We don't have to do it alone. And then another principle, it seems to me, is the recognition that we're all have much more wisdom and intuitive sensitivity within us than we usually recognize, and much of psychological growth and spiritual maturation is an attuning to our own inner guidance, our own inner wisdom, and so when we're with a teacher or someone, just taking the time to feel really carefully and sensitively into our own intuitive feeling and response to this person seems very appropriate. And certainly when we look at being fooled by ourselves, boy, having friends is a great is a great blessing. And most of all, I would recommend a spouse. You know, you can fool a lot of people, but you can't fool your spouse for long. Arthur Dykman's a wonderful psychiatrist who made many contributions to this field, and he has what I think is the best test of enlightenment, which is ask the spouse. and at first I thought it was just a joke, and then the more I thought about it, the more I've come to appreciate that's a pretty smart test.
And I know you've written about conscious relationship, which is what I love. When people ask me sometimes what my spiritual path is, today I say conscious relationship, because I say that it's the hardest work I've ever done.
Yeah. It's the advanced yoga, isn't it? It really is. I've been so humbled, you know. I'll come out of a 3-month retreat doing intensive meditation all day for, several months at a time, and then come back into relationship and be very rapidly humbled. There are just facets of ourselves that come out in relationships that we can hide from ourselves. We get a kind of direct feedback in relationship, both verbal and non-verbal, that is like being hooked up to a human biofeedback machine. And you used the term particularly conscious relationship, and it seems to me that when we enter into a relationship and have and make an explicit agreement to use the relationship for our mutual learning and awakening, that just opens possibilities even beyond ordinary relationship. It has the possibility of transforming the relationship into a true yoga in which we invite feedback, critical feedback, any feedback in which we practice the yoga of truth-telling. And truth-telling is just an extraordinarily powerful practice. I just keep thinking that the words of Jesus, "the truth will set you free," are some of the most profound that have hit this planet and have an extraordinary potential in any relationship. So I think your term and your idea of conscious relationship as a path is first very important and valuable and insightful, and second, in some ways new, because it's interesting. If you look across the world's spiritual traditions, a lot of them emphasize relationship, but it's almost always teacher-student relationship. It's rarely that peer relationships are acknowledged. And in Francis and my survey of world traditions, we really haven't found, with one exception, a path which uses peer relationships as its primary focus. The only thing we've found is the teachings for A Course in Miracles, the Christian contemplative practices, and there, specifically, it uses relationship, peer relationship as the primary focus.
And that's so hard to state, even in the Western world, when everybody's on the go and so mobile, and nobody stays in one spot for a long enough time, I think, myself included, certainly, to be able to harness that and foster that. It's really difficult.
Yes, it's a challenge, and there's also a gift in being in our transpersonal world or in a spiritual world of any kind, and that is there are fewer people as you go. I think the deeper you go into spiritual life, in some ways the fewer people you find who are making the same kind of commitment, but the other side of that coin is the blessing is when you meet people with a similar commitment, the connection has the potential for going deeper so much faster and being so much more powerful. And it's like, oh yes, all right, of course, and you just can cut through so many of the standard preliminaries and meet at a wonderfully deep place. And that's been one of the delights of going to transpersonal conferences around the world, is to find fellow spirits and to meet very quickly and very deeply, from different cultures, languages, traditions, spiritual traditions, etc. It's like somehow they just drop away.
Speaking of the conference, have you thought anything about what maybe you want to talk about, especially as we head on into 2012?
Well, the theme of the topic is spiritual path, promises and pitfalls, and that's a pretty big topic. And I look at a talk like this as an opportunity and stimulus to kind of deepen my own thinking. So, what exactly will come out, I'm not sure, but I'm sure I will learn from it, and hopefully others will too. So I'm grateful for this opportunity. It'll be wonderful to have hundreds of people coming from different countries and parts of this country to gather and explore this very timely topic in a new way, because clearly we do have the possibility for exploring in new ways. Because if you look at the classic spiritual texts, it took me a while to realize what is now so painfully obvious, that we've gotten very sanitized and bowdlerized accounts of spiritual life. Classically, it's something like so-and-so heard the teachings, retired into the forest, meditated, and got enlightened. Well, that's like saying boy met girl, rode off into the sunset, and lived happily ever after. Yeah, we're right. Well, we all know something's missing from that story, and I think it's taken us a while to realize just how much is missing from the classical stories, and that we really have not been given good maps of the spiritual pitfalls. And one of the opportunities of our time is to begin to map out those pitfalls using the best of both spiritual insight and contemporary clinical materials and ideas. And that's a unique opportunity.